Welcome to Running the Table, the podcast where we run through everything on the table in the world of college basketball. Purdue marches into Iowa City and puts a thorough beatdown on the Iowa Hawkeyes, showing no signs of the battle that occurred just a month ago in Mackey Arena. But without further ado, let's run it. This one was a start to finish win with a final score of Purdue 78, Iowa 57. There was no look ahead to be found, no traps, just business handled. Especially the business of Bennett Sturts. He got his as per usual, but we made him work for it, and he really didn't catch his stride until late, or at least most of the way through the second half. Kind of going over Iowa first. Sturts was once again the main story. He had his 19 points in this one on a pretty efficient 7 of 12 shooting, 2 for 6 from 3 with 5 rebounds and an assist. I think the bigger thing was the fact that he didn't try to do more. He had been on a tear recently, averaging 30 points per game, 30.5 points per game over the first 4 games of this month, shooting 66% from the floor in that stretch and 56% from three. He chose to go a bit of an unusual route in this one, kind of diverting more to his teammates, especially in the first half. And unlike the first matchup, it just didn't quite work. This game started out relatively slow. There wasn't a ton of scoring over the first couple of minutes, but after those first couple of minutes, things started to settle in, especially on the Purdue side, and we were able to jump out to a 22-9 lead 10 minutes in. In that rough start for Purdue to start, or kind of for both teams, but the reason why it ended up being a slow start for Purdue is we started 1 for 7 from 3, but that did not continue. As we settled in, we just kind of kept finding those open looks, and they really started to fall, especially from our role players, and we'll talk about that as we get into more of the individual guys. But really, I think the story of this game was Bennett Sturts and just the stopping or inhibiting of his performance. And we really did a good job on that. CJ Cox and Jakari Harris were the biggest difference makers in that, being the primary on-ball defender for pretty much the entire time that they were in the game. I know Braden took at least a couple of minutes here and there on him. But Sturts did not do as much as I expected when it comes to just his overall role. We did make things hard for him, but he was also surprisingly willing to give up the ball. I saw many a times, whether or not it was him bringing the ball down the floor, but he would give the ball up to the wing and kind of run off to the opposite side. And in a lot of possessions, not even necessarily try to make much of an effort to get it back. Part of it was certainly Purdue's, concerted effort to try to keep the ball out of his hands and get him to give up the ball and make it that much harder to get back. But it just seemed like the effort and the sense of urgency for him, knowing full well, I mean, Ben McCollum knows, Bennett Sturts knows, Iowa knows their offense is basically Bennett Sturts. And yes, you'll get some buckets here and there from other guys. They need that if they're going to succeed, but if the ball's not in Sturts' hands, you're not going to have a ton of success. They just don't have the offensive playmaking, the scoring around him to really make that a viable alternative solution. So I was surprised that he, was seemingly okay with just kind of giving up the ball sometimes, especially in some of the matchups. There was a couple pick and rolls where Purdue decided that it wasn't quite working for the hedge, and we actually went a full switch, and there was at least a play or two where I saw Bennett Sturts get switched on to TKR, and I was like, ooh, don't like that matchup at all. There was maybe a time or two that he attacked it, but there was also at least a time or two where he just gave the ball right back up and said, nope, not going to take advantage of that. That was astonishing to me. I think that was the biggest shock out of this game. Yes, Purdue played well. Yes, Iowa did not play that well. But there were some things in Iowa's hands and in Bennett Sturts' hands that, just didn't seem conducive to them making their best effort to win this game. And I'm not going to say that it was, from like a statement trying to be made by Bennett Sturts of like, give it to the other guys and oh, guess what? They can't do anything and we're going to lose if the ball's in their hands. That's not the type of guy that he is, not that I think or not that I know of. But with his mentality of, just kind of giving the ball up as often as he did, he only had 7 first half points. He, obviously we talked about in the game, 7 for 12 shooting. It's not like he just, shot the ball a bunch and had an off shooting night. He had a very efficient shooting night. He just didn't take as many shots as I was expecting. Obviously, he got a bit more up in the second half. Ended up with 12 in the second half to finish with 19. But looking at these two matchups specifically, there really is only one main difference, and it's actually not necessarily Sturtz's willingness to give up the ball because he did that plenty. He was 7 for 15 in the first game, 7 for 12 in this one. Not that big of a difference. The difference was the role players. We talked about in the previous recap of this matchup back in mid-January, a month ago, that they seemed to get really, really lucky with some of those shots falling of the, bounce 3 or 4 times here and there and fall on the soft Mackey rims. They did not get those bounces here. In the first game, they were 12 for 25 from three, good for 48%. Well, in this one, only 6 for 22, 27%. Half of their makes and 3 less shots. So that was a major difference in this one. And players specifically, Cale Combs was a huge contributor in this game at Mackey earlier on last month. He had 16 points in that one. He had a goose egg. He was out there for, let's see, he was out there for 13 minutes, which honestly was not as much as I would have expected it would be, but I think he didn't get as much time because he was struggling so much. 0 points, 0 for 5 from the floor, a rebound, assist, and a turnover. I mean, he was the biggest flip from previous game to this one in terms of, his role. But the other one was Cam Mannion, and he had 13 points in the first game, 8 points in this one. Not necessarily a massive difference, but I mean, double figures to not double figures is significant enough to mention. But really, it was almost just the aspect of how aggressive he looked against Purdue's front court. In that first game, he was taking it to Purdue. He didn't necessarily, have an overtly insane game. He was 5 for 8 from the floor, 3 rebounds and an assist. But you saw him going at TK, or you saw him going at Clough. He would, go, and at Jacobson too, especially. But he would go into those guys, get a bucket, and show some emotion. And this one, you just didn't see that same kind of fire. And I think part of it is because Purdue jumped out to as significant of a lead early on. We kind of took the air you know, uh, out of Iowa's arena. And hence taking the air out of some of the players as well. With at Purdue, it was a hostile environment. It's kind of easier to get the emotions going and the juices flowing when you're battling a crowd. And obviously the game was closer, but they didn't have that same fight in this one. The other thing to mention was the fact that they had slightly more bench points in this one, but way more shots to get them. In the first matchup, they had 10 points on 4 of 9 shooting from the bench. This game, they had 18 points from the bench, so you got 8 more points, but on 6 of 18 shooting. So it took them 9 more shots to get those 8 more points. And that's just not a great recipe for success in terms of efficiency off the bench, and not exactly what you're looking for from your role players. It was good to see that they got some more action. They got some more shots up. They went a lot deeper in their bench this time. They only went 8 deep in the first game. They went 5, 8. They went 11 deep in this game. Now, some players barely in. I mean, they put Mattioni, I don't even know who that is, in for 1 singular minute. But they went to a lot more different directions because they were struggling to find, matchups that worked, lineups that were particularly efficient. And I think really one of the big stories was in the second half when Purdue was able to, really extend on that lead that they built in the first half. Iowa was missing a lot of layups. That was something that was pretty striking from this game. They had a couple of pretty good opportunities where it just the shots fell short. It was either too short on hook shots, too strong on layups. They did not look confident around the rim. And while Iowa was struggling with that, Purdue then went on a tear with CJ Cox hitting all 4 of his threes on the night and Benter adding in 1 more of his own over the course of just 4 minutes to help extend the Boilers' lead to its highest point of the night at 27. So, we built that lead in the first half, but it was the second half when we really settled in, especially with the 3-point shooting that I mentioned, and just started giving it to him. CJ obviously being huge in that. Him shooting well is a massive difference maker for this team. You'll see, in some of the games that we've had more recently where it's like iffy performances, maybe not winning as convincingly as we thought that we could have. And that kind of coinciding a lot with whether CJ Cox is hitting his open shots or if he's getting his open shots. In this one, we were able to find him, and he was knocking down on a high clip at a high level in this one. So it's great to see him have that type of confidence. And we'll talk about him here pretty soon. But in that 4 minute span, we went 5 for 6 from three. CJ had one miss in between those his four makes and Benter's one in that span. But that was a huge, again, just it just killed the crowd. It killed the players, the arena, any momentum that they were trying to generate in terms of getting their way back into this game. Just kind of killed it all right there. But heading over to Purdue specifically, I want to highlight the fact we had four double-digit scorers in this one, and not necessarily just the starters. We had three of the four as a starter, but Jakari Harris off the bench played a masterful game, and we'll group both Jakari and CJ in this one because they both had 14 points apiece. And the big thing for them was their three-point shooting. They found open shots. Jakari actually hit at least one or two contested ones as well. But they were 7 for 15 combined from three. So those guys are huge in terms of finding open shots and a great beneficiary to Braden's passing, which he put on full display in this one. But both of those guys looked great, and they were a huge difference maker on the offensive end as well as the defensive end, because as I mentioned earlier, they both handled the Sturts assignment for most of the night, and they had 4 steals combined. Jakari had three, and CJ had one. So both of those guys played fantastic in their roles in this one, and really Purdue is an exponentially better team when those two specifically are having great nights. And this one was no different. But moving on to Lawyer in this one, I was pleased to see. He got to his double figures. He ended up with 12 on the night, but he didn't necessarily have to be a massive volume shooter to get there. He was 3 for 7 from the floor, 2 for 5 from three, knocked down all four of his free throws, and added in 3 assists as well. So I'm much more comfortable with him being you know, find your shots when they're there. The fact that he was willing to give the ball up when, we got Iowa's defense scrambling. It was good to see that he could knock down his shots without having to get, 10 up. And I think a big plus was the fact that we didn't necessarily have to go back to the well on him a ton like we did, in the Nebraska game of getting him 17 threes, partially because the other guys were hitting threes. We weren't just trying to force the ball to him as the only guy knocking down shots, and that allowed him to get even more open looks, do different things with the ball, and be just an overall relatively efficient scorer without having to be super ball dominant or super shot dominant. But past him, got to talk about TKR as well. 12 and 12 on the night. He had 12 points on 5 of 8 shooting. So again, a very efficient night in limited shooting. I think we're seeing more and more of that from TKR. And I like that as long as, he's able to get some of those shots. And he certainly converted a lot more in this game than we've seen in some of the previous games where teams took him away very well. And they took away Purdue's pick and roll a fair amount, not entirely. Obviously, he got a fair amount going, but we found other ways to get him involved as well. I think we opened the game with one of Lawyer's assists was a drop down to TKR for a quick seal layup, a fantastic play call out of the gate. He had a couple other ones like that during the game, more traditional post up, spinning off the right shoulder to get a layup on the left block, things like that, where, he doesn't have to be just a pick and short roll scorer. He can score in different ways, especially if we're willing to, run a couple of plays trying to get him those opportunities, especially if teams are going to only go one-on-one with him in the post like they did at least one of those times there. But past that, the rebounding is, of course, the other massive highlight. We need him to continue rebounding. These past 2 games have been fantastic. We've seen stretches like this out of him earlier. He is going to be keeping it up, especially with, some of these big time matchups coming up. We are going to need that from him and of course from Clough as well. But he has been arguably our most consistent rebounder across, many of these games. And quite frankly, this is arguably an A+ night for him in terms of the efficient scoring, the rebounding. He only had 1 turnover. I don't think we can ask much more from him in the type of role that we are now putting TKR in as a team. But heading over kind of to the rest of the crew outside of our double-digit scores, I obviously want to start with Braden. He may not have had a great offensive night, but it was playmaking galore. They really didn't give him a too much space on the pick and roll. They were really up in his business, up in his grill all game. But he handled the pressure wonderfully and really used it to make one of his best playmaking performances in recent memory. He had 12 assists to only one turnover and added on 7 rebounds and a steal for overall just a fantastic performance, even without the scoring. He was 1 for 5, so he tried to get some shots going here and there, but overall the opportunities weren't quite there. He didn't necessarily try to force it, which I'm totally fine with, especially when we're hitting from other areas. I think if you saw us struggle a little bit more from the floor, he might have tried to force the issue, getting a couple more shots down the stretch if this were closer and he trying to, keep this game out of getting out of hand. Kind of like the way things happened in the Nebraska game. Close game, us losing the lead. He tries to take it a little bit more into his own hands rather than continuing with the playmaking. But those 12 assists were fantastic. Obviously, so many guys were the beneficiary to some fantastic, cross court passes. Him dribbling around and finding somebody on the underneath. I think at least Jacobson had one play that he was the beneficiary of that. So I love when Braden scores the ball, but I think it's more important that we get the elite playmaking than we get, crazy scoring. Obviously, the crazy scoring is great when it comes, when the matchup allows for it. But Purdue is at its highest when Braden is whipping passes around the court and other guys are confidently stepping in and knocking down shots. But past him, we'll talk about Clough. Relatively quiet, 4-5-3 game, 4 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists. But he also got a steal and a block. And he also knocked down both of his free throws, which is great. Only one offensive rebound out of those 5, not necessarily the dominant offensive rebounding that we had seen in the last game and in some of these games. But overall, I'm not going to be, I'm not too upset with his performance, mainly because he didn't play as much as he could have. He ended up with 20 minutes, but he did pick up his second foul with 7 minutes to go in the first half, and then his third with 13 and a half to go. So he sat for some pretty big chunks there, which then allowed Jacobson to get some more time and put in some work. And we'll talk about him next. He had 6 points and 4 rebounds as well as 3 blocks. So it was great to see him get his shot blocking going again. He had been a little quiet in that category recently. I think the biggest thing is out of his 20 minutes, probably would also like to see a couple more rebounds. 5 for Clough in his 24 for Jacobson in his 20. TKR out rebounding both of them in his 31 minutes. So still need a little bit more rebounding out of the center position. But Jacobson was a solid lob threat for at least one of those plays in there. And I would say I think he battled a bit better than I've seen him do recently. So I think I want to focus on that, focus on the positives that I saw out of his performance rather than keep nitpicking. I've been a little bit harsh on him as a redshirt freshman who's still kind of trying to find his way around the league. So overall, pretty happy with his minutes, even without some of that rebounding. But looking more to the bench, going to Omer Meyer, he had 6 points, a rebound, an assist, and a turnover. I think the big thing for him is he was 2 for 6 from the floor, but 2 of 5 of those were from three, and he had one missed mid-range jumper. For him, especially when he's going to be playing alongside Braden, which Braden played 36 minutes, so Omer was playing alongside him for a fair amount of Omer's 16 minutes. He's going to have to be able to knock down his threes when he gets them. So shooting 40% from three, again, continuing to get more and more comfortable with his shot. I will take that any day of the week. He had a little bit of opportunities with the ball in his hands, whether Braden was off the floor or running Braden a little bit more off ball. And again, he continues to look more confident, only getting one turnover. The big thing for him as a true freshman is, building up that skill and that comfortability with the ball in his hands without turning the ball over a lot. And he's continued to get better and better with that as the season went on. And I think that today was another good showing of that. But lastly, rounding out the bench, we'll talk about Benter, who had a quick 5 points on 2 of 4 shooting, 1 for 3 from three, an assist and a turnover. But he was only in for 10 minutes because we played TKR as much as we did, having some success with him and obviously his dominant presence on the boards. We couldn't go with Benter that much at the 4. but he took advantage of his limited opportunities. I mean, 5 points in 10 minutes. The big thing is, once again, will he hit his open threes? And he was 1 for 3, so can't be too upset about that. I think the only thing that's interesting to highlight is he's been such a good rebounder throughout the course of this year. He didn't end up with a rebound in this one, but I think that speaks more to the team rebounding that we had kind of around him, with 5 rebounds from Jakari, 2 from CJ, and 7 from Braden. You had more rebounding from the guards than you've had in some of these other games. So he was still battling out there and being a very solid defensive presence, without or defensive and rebounding presence, without that necessarily showing up in the stat sheet. But looking over to some of the team stats, we were 25 for 53 from the floor, good for 47%. Not necessarily our best shooting night overall. We didn't have a ton of success from 2 point range outside of, some of our buckets from TKR and the inside. I think really our money was made from the 3 point line in this one, just because Iowa was given to them to us, and thankfully we were knocking them down. We went 12 for 30 from the 3 point line, good for 40% in this one. So once again, a second game in a row where we've reached 30 plus threes, which I won't say is unusual for Purdue. We will shoot plenty of threes if we get them, because we have the shooters to do so, and we don't have a ton of guys that want to slash, get into the basket, other than our couple of guys that find their home in the mid range. But I think the bigger thing to highlight is that we knock down the shots that they gave us. So if teams are going to give us these threes, and we're going to be able to navigate the front court and be able to kick out and find these threes, we're going to take them, and it's important that we make them. And in this game we did, and that was a big part of the reason why we were able to build up that lead, especially with that tear that I talked about between CJ Cox and Jack Benter, with those 5 threes in 4 minutes. That's the difference maker for our team, and being able to pull away from teams in games like this. But another great highlight is 16 for 20 from the free throw line. Once again, Iowa fouls a fair amount. They did again in this one. Iowa ended up with 19 fouls on the night, and that did send us to the line a fair amount. But shooting 80% from the free throw line is always great. That is above average for us as a team that averages, I'm pretty sure, around 75% from the free throw line typically. 74%. So right around there. So once again, us reaching that mark is great, especially some of the guys more specifically that were able to knock down their free throws. TKR going 2 for 2, Clough going 2 for 2. 2 out of our 4 misses came from Jacobson. He was 2 for 4. But then 0 for 1 from Meyer and 3 for 4 from Braden accounted for those other 2 misses. So across the board, knocking down free throws when we get them, especially getting to the line that much. We're not a team that gets to the line a ton, just because, again, when you shoot threes a lot, you're not going to get to the 3 point line, or sorry, to the free throw line nearly as much. But this one was just more of a matter of getting into the bonus, and being able to step up and knock down those free throws. But lastly, kind of talking about the rebounding battle like we typically do, this one was a bit closer than I would say I would like it to be, but not a horrible showing overall. We won the rebounding battle 38-30 in total, 10-9 on the offensive glass. I think realistically that one is too close. Getting 10 offensive rebounds is great. I think that's something that we should do with our offensive rebounding threats, especially on a team that is as limited inside in terms of size and aggressiveness like in Iowa. The bigger thing is giving up 9 offensive rebounds. We really realistically got to clean that up. I think as the game went on and we were able to hold the lead like we were, I think we got a little bit casual, a little bit more informal on our defensive rebounding, or at least our boxing out, and that allowed them to reel in a couple more offensive rebounds in the second half. But we won 28-21 on the defensive end, and that was good. There was a fair amount of missed shots, especially from Iowa. So it allowed for plenty of rebounding opportunities. Always happy to out rebound them. By a significant margin. I think what would classify as a good showing for Purdue, and what we should aim for on a game-to-game basis, is trying to win that battle by 10 plus. So I won't say that winning it by 8 is bad necessarily, but it's closer than it should have been against this type of team. And I think that's the thing to highlight, especially heading into some of these games against elite rebounding teams. But heading over to some of our advanced analytics, our advanced box score stats, courtesy of sportsreference.com. I want to start out by highlighting Jakari Harris. Again, we talk about how good of a performance that he had. His box plus minus of 33.5. He looked fantastic, and you combine that with his offensive rating and steal percentage, offensive rating being at 170, and the steal percentage of being 10%. That's not common. I think it just shows how active he was on the defensive end, and just what a complete performance that he put forward, and he's deserving of leading the team in that stat of box plus minus. And quite frankly, I think that was arguably his best performance of the year, except for maybe his electric 4-3 night off the bench against Auburn earlier on this year. But looking at some of these team numbers as a whole, looking at box plus minus and guys like Oscar Clough with 19.8, he may not have necessarily had a super active offensive night, but the advanced analytics love efficiency and him shooting 100% 1-for-1 from the floor, as well as knocking down both of his free throws, combined with the fact that he stuffed the stat sheet everywhere else. Those 5 rebounds, 3 assists, a block, a steal. He made his mark everywhere else, and I think that it shows that he had a very good performance, but I don't want to call that stat misleading. I don't know if I would necessarily say that he was our second best player in this game. Speaking of misleading, I think that shows how much box plus minus was misleading for Trey Kaufman-Renn. I mean, TKR had a fantastic performance in this one. I talked about it. I think this was an A+ performance for him. But just with the way that the analytics kind of fell, and his shooting, I guess I don't know. I personally don't necessarily know what calculated a 6.2 for him, considering the fact that he scored in double figures, he rebounded in double figures. I don't know. That one I think is the most misleading. I think they undersell that performance given what we asked him to do in this game. Another thing to highlight would be Braden's assist percentage. Once again, 55%, over 50% of Purdue's baskets. And I think more specifically and more interestingly, 80% as a whole for the team. We had 20 assists on 25 made shots. Again, fantastic team basketball. And that's how I would love to see Purdue continue to play over the course of the season. We are best when we are moving the ball, when we are shooting off of passes rather than trying to play one-on-one ball. I think that's more of an indicator of we're having some difficult time scoring the ball, and Braden or Fletch, tries to take the ball and go one-on-one, driving into the lane and getting a shot up there. And the other one to highlight would be defensive rebound percentage. I think, looking at individual stats, obviously, TKR with 32.3. He rebounded the ball very well on the defensive end, and as a whole for the team, that's 77.8%. I think it accurately shows that we had a pretty good, but not necessarily great night on the boards. Once again, trying to aim for that over 80% defensive rebounding percentage, and then that 28.6% on the offensive end shows that again we were able to get a fair amount of offensive rebounds, but we didn't necessarily dominate quite as well as we did against Nebraska. But overall, it was a great win against a really sneaky good team in Iowa, despite their ugly loss at Maryland earlier this week. The big thing for them is they still need to kind of pick things back up to be truly comfortable by getting into the NCAA tournament. They've got a couple of tough games ahead, similar to Purdue. But I think more importantly, Purdue handled business exactly like they needed to get right before their biggest challenge of the season. Speaking of that challenge, coming up next, the soon-to-be #1 Michigan Wolverines will enter Mackey Arena on Tuesday for the Rumble in the Jungle, a heavyweight battle to remember that we will all be glued to the TV for. The Wolverines struggled majorly in Mackey last year, and they fully expect the paint crew to remind them exactly why and give them some PTSD from last year's game. I truly can't wait to see how this one turns out. I do expect it to be a little bit more of a battle than last one, but really hope that Purdue can step up to the challenge, similarly to how they did at Nebraska earlier this week. But that's all I've got for today. We are in the end game now. Halfway through February, Tuesday's game is going to really make or break Purdue's chances of sneaking away with the Big Ten title. But regardless of the outcome, I will be here to cover that and much more on the road to March Madness. But if you want more from us, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, I'm out.